Now, as I mentioned earlier, chatting all things St Albans to MP for St Albans, Daisy Cooper. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
On the show. How are you, first of all?
Yeah, I'm doing all right, thank you. Yeah, having a busy day.
And, you know, after speaking to various other different MPs over the, not necessarily on air, but in general, it's been busy times for yourselves, hasn't it?
It certainly has, yeah. To give you an idea of how busy it's been, I think I had about 300 new cases in January, 300 in February, and then 1,700 in March. So
Wow.
it gives you a sense of how things have increased. They went up about sixfold for March and April, but my team are working. My team and I are working really hard. We've put the hours in, and we're hoping that we've managed to help a lot of people.
Well done to you. Well done to you and your team, of course. Now, I want to talk to you about St Albans. I'm, very familiar with St Albans. I've got a lot of friends over there and spent many times over there. Familiar with the football club, etc. So I know the area really well. How has the local residents, in your view, coped with and adjusted to the times over the last few months?
Sure. Well, I think people have responded differently depending on what their experience of COVID has been, and I think for some people it's been just a little bit of a blip, and for other people it's been an absolute tsunami. So obviously I think some people who have managed to keep their jobs, and maybe they're on furlough, they're sort of obviously still struggling probably with the mental health of it all, but there are others who have really struggled because their lives and livelihoods have been turned upside down. So, of course, like everywhere, we have a lot of frontline workers, whether that's people in the NHS or in care or, public transport, and, the staff at the council as well who have been distributing food boxes, supermarket workers. Lots of frontline workers have been getting stuck in. Volunteers, we've had hundreds of people volunteering in St Albans, either locally for Community First, where they've been going sort of door-to-door delivering food or collecting prescriptions, but obviously lots of people making masks and things like that as well. Our businesses have changed their business models almost overnight. Many of them, lots of lovely independent shops and restaurants now sort of delivering to people's doors. And I think the public at large in St Albans have been following the guidelines. So I think there's been a real lovely sense of community, but of course now I think there's a little bit of apprehension about what comes next.
Yes, because there's some lovely open spaces in and around St Albans as well. Has that been tricky to manage throughout the last couple of months or so?
So actually, we haven't really had many problems in the open spaces at all until just the last few days. So I think because people have had the impression that restrictions are being lifted, there have been a lot more people going into parks and leaving their litter there, and our council responded really quickly, and they're going to be taking extra measures in the parks at weekends, putting out extra bins and encouraging people to use them. But broadly speaking, throughout the pandemic, people have stuck to the rules and have been enjoying the parks for their a lot of time of exercise.
Oh, well, that's good news. That's good to hear. So, moving forwards, restrictions are slowly starting to ease. We've got some non-essential shops that are going to be open from the middle of the month, 15th of June, I believe it is. What can we expect in St Albans regarding the layout, maybe? Is there any road closures or one-way sections? And I know St Albans Bid have been really proactive in this as well, haven't they?
They have. I think nationally, we have to keep an eye on this date because the government has been clear that these non-essential shops will open, but only if we meet certain measures. And so we obviously have to make sure that the R rate is still down. So there'll be national guidance on whether that can go ahead. But if the opening of non-essential shops does go ahead, then I suspect, in St Albans, like in other places, you'll start to see things like signage in the shops, one-way queuing systems, possibly hand sanitizer on the door. Those kind of things I expect will be in most shops anywhere in the country. Here in St Albans, we have, throughout the pandemic and in recent weeks, been trialling little micro-hubs. So businesses that haven't been able to open have been operating off the premises of pubs. So there's been sort of mobile coffee units and things, which has been really good to support local businesses that otherwise can't trade, and it's brought essential goods into local communities so that people don't have to go as far or don't have to go to the supermarket to get them. But we have had some road closures as well, which hopefully will help to allow people to move around more freely in the sort of shopping area. So along Peter Street, which is obviously the main market road, that we have in St Albans, as well as George Street, which has a number of independent shops, and out on Hatfield Road as well. There were a few hiccups on Hatfield Road because the County Council did close some of the parking bays without consulting the local businesses, but we seem to find that out now. So we've now got a number of roads where they are essentially closed for traffic, and that means that the market as well as shops can continue to trade whilst respecting the social distancing measures.
Yeah, that was my next question about the market. How is something like that going to work? It's a great market. Love the market over there. How's that going to work? Or how does that work?
Well, the outside markets have never really been closed, and in many respects are actually much safer than going into a supermarket, because obviously you're outdoors, and so you don't have the sort of ventilation system and all the kind of enclosed queuing that you have inside. So the market has continued, so it hasn't stopped, but it is going to have to change, and it is already working differently. So the number of stalls have been reduced to make sure that there is space in between the different market stalls. Initially, during COVID, the food stalls were just contained just to the food, those that were selling food, but very soon that was going to be expanded to some other sort of non-food stalls, like selling flowers and things like that, and gifts. We've had to see, unfortunately, there's had to be more pre-wrapped goods for sale, which is a bit disappointing on the plastic front, but it has been important for public health. And of course, we've got staff from the local council who are patrolling the market to make sure that social distancing rules are being followed, both by the market traders and by the public at large.
Excellent. And it's been some great weather for markets and outdoor markets over the last couple of months. I want to ask you about a couple of other things. The Abbey Flyer, or the Abbey line, used it many times, and it's an important part, a link from Watford to St Albans to Watford. And you got some news on that about the passing loop. Great idea. I love the idea of it, of how it's going to.
Well, that's it. I mean, there's the idea of having a passing loop, so that, let me start with what we have at the moment. At the moment, we have a single track line that goes from St Albans to Watford, and so the train's got to go one way and then it's got to come back the other, which means that it's very slow, it doesn't go very often, and sometimes it's a little bit unreliable. So it hasn't, because it hasn't been used so much, there's been a real lack of investment. So if we get a passing loop, it means you can have trains going in both directions at the same time, which will improve the frequency and the number of trains, and then hopefully that will attract more investment, which will then lead to a more reliable service. And fundamentally, if we can get it up and running, that means we can get people off the roads and out of their cars and onto public transport between St Albans and Watford, which is a really crucial route for lots of people, for lots of residents, but especially for key workers as well. So the idea of having a passing loop is a real no-brainer. The Abbey Flyer users group and lots of local residents associations along the line have been championing this idea for years. And finally, the government has agreed to give a small amount of money to develop the business case. So we don't have the money for the actual passing loop yet, but we have got some money to develop the business case for it. So we're heading in the right direction. So it's a good step forward. Yeah,
it's definitely a good idea. Just a passing loop. One train can go one way, the other one can continue, or just wait till it passes, goes the other way. You're doubling the trains, and it's a good time for this case to be put forward. To be honest, exactly like you say, try and take cars off the road as much as we can. I want to ask you a couple of things about yourself now. Also, I was chatting to our elected mayor, Peter Taylor, who I believe you know, Peter, and we was chatting away. And the three of us have got a particular thing in common, our love for the British pub. And I know you've been really proactive, and that's one thing about St Albans. It's all the local communities have always supported the local pubs. There's so many off the beaten track, just down off the high street or off Checker Street, down the little roads and in the back roads. So many of them, and yet they've always been sustainable. And you've been a part of trying to make sure that always stays. How do you think that's going to progress over the next few months?
Sure. Well, our pubs are in a really precarious situation. They've already had to struggle for years with a huge increase in business rates, and now some of them, to varying degrees, have benefited from the government package, the government support packages through coronavirus, but some of them haven't benefited at all. So we've got this very broken business rate system, which basically puts different pubs into different categories, into how they're taxed, even though they're kind of roughly the same size, there's this really kind of broken system that works out which bits of the pub, get taxed and what have you. And it means that some pubs haven't managed to access any support whatsoever. And those are the ones that are going to particularly struggle. So some of them, have managed to furlough their staff. Some of them have managed to get loans, but quite frankly, we do need some more grants from the government to keep our pubs going. And of course, pubs are being told by the government they're going to be one of the last industries to be allowed to reopen, because obviously the whole purpose of a pub is to bring people socially together, not to keep them socially distanced. The entire business model relies on bringing people together in pubs. So I think, as restrictions start to ease, we'll have to see what happens with the rate at which the coronavirus spreads, and if it can be kept under control. Hopefully at some point we can talk about reopening pubs. But in the meantime, we'll have to think about whether there's anything we can do differently. Can we, for example, enable some pubs that have outdoor space, or maybe face a high street, to have socially distanced tables outside, for example? There's lots of different things that we're going to have to look at with our pub community, and I know some of those conversations have started already. But there's no doubt it's a really, really difficult time for our pubs because of the broken business rate system, and now also because of the gaps in the package of support, which means that some of them haven't benefited. So it's going to be a tough period of time, and I think for anybody who's got the ability to go out and spend money when the pubs are open, I'd encourage them to have a responsible pint or two to help support our local pubs and restaurants.
Oh, I love a pub. Anyone who knows me knows I love a pub. Last couple of quick questions. E-scooters, trials in St Albans. Yeah. Your thoughts on that and how you think they are?
Well, Grant Shapps, who is the Secretary of State for Transport and the Hertfordshire MP, he's announced that a trial for e-scooters, which is going to take place next year, has been brought forward to this month, to June. And so I've written to him and asked if St Albans could be included in this trial for e-scooters. Now, e-scooters have been a little bit controversial in the past because people have said they've raised the safety concerns. But studies have been done in other countries which show that if you get the right measures in place, then it's just as safe to use an e-scooter as it is as if you're cycling. So, for example, different e-scooters go at different paces. So if you're on a slower one, then being on an e-scooter is comparable to being on a bike. But if you've got a really fast one, then it needs to be treated like a motorcycle. So if you can regulate, you can regulate for different provisions and how people can use those different e-scooters. And the same with having a dedicated cycle line. You need a dedicated cycle lane for an e-scooter as well. And you need to make sure that there's a pricing mechanism so that people aren't incentivized to sort of take risks or speed up to make sure they return their e-scooter or their bike, in time. So if you get the right measures in place to look after the people who are using e-scooters, there's no reason why there needs to be, a danger on the road. So they can be just as safe as cycling, and importantly, they hopefully will get people out of their cars into more active modes of transport.
I'm looking forward to seeing how the e-scooter develops over the next few years, because I would definitely, I'd definitely like to be whizzing round on one, very safely, of course.
Of course.
And the last question is, I noticed that you've been quite vocal and regarding the voting system in Parliament. An hour and 20 odd minutes you was. Is that right? You was waiting to vote. Can you just tell us briefly about what it's for and how it's changed in recent times?
Sure. So since COVID hit as a pandemic, MPs have moved gradually onto a system of being what's called a hybrid parliament. Initially a virtual parliament and a hybrid parliament. So it means that only 50 people can go into the actual physical chamber, which you normally see on the TV, and lots of other MPs from all over the country have managed to take part in the parliamentary proceedings from home. And so it's entirely possible for me to sit at home and to table urgent questions of the government, to listen to what ministers are saying and to ask questions. I've taken part in debates on legislation, and I've managed to vote online as well. I've managed to do all of that from home. And Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is the leader of the House of Commons, decided that he didn't want this system to carry on. So he engineered for a vote in Parliament yesterday to make sure that it didn't continue. Now, because the regulations which allowed us to do all this online participation and voting had actually expired, we had to vote yesterday on whether or not to continue with the virtual parliament. We actually had to vote physically. And because of social distancing, we had to all vote 2 metres apart, which meant that we had what looked like a conga going all the way around the parliamentary estate, through the big Westminster Hall, out into the outside garden area, back in through a corridor, up an escalator around the cafeteria. And it was an enormously long queue. It took an hour and 20 minutes to vote twice. And I'm just very grateful that it wasn't raining, because we all have got very, very wet. But it was a real muddle. It took way too much time, and it was a completely absurd situation. And if you've seen the newspapers in any other country, you'll see that it's made us a little bit more of a laughing stock, which is really regrettable. So the government has realised how ridiculous it is to some degree, because part of the controversy was that MPs who are shielding, or who have members of their family who are shielding, or they don't have they have childcare responsibilities, those MPs were completely excluded from having that vote yesterday, and completely excluded from voting in anything else. So the government has done a tiny U-turn today by saying that any MP who is shielding or stuck at home for medical reasons can still take part online, but the rest of us have to still go in. And that's worrying, because I'm very worried about my community, and I don't want to go into Parliament and become a super spreader and perhaps pick up COVID and bring it back to the community that I'm trying to represent. So I think it's a very bad system, but hopefully the government has seen sense in terms of at least allowing MPs to take part remotely if they're shielding. The rest of us will have to keep going in.
Well, that does sound slightly unnecessary, so without going into it too much. Sounds slightly unnecessary with the times we're in. Well, look, thank you so much, Daisy, for taking the time out. I know I've crammed a lot in there, but I know you're busy, so to get you back on, it might be a bit tricky in the near future. But
we'll find the time.
Yeah, definitely. Do stay safe. Keep up the good work, what you're doing over at St Albans. It's fantastic seeing all the work that's being done, both in the local community and in the businesses as well. So thank you so much for joining me. Stay safe, and I'll speak to you again. Thank you very much, Daisy. Cheers.